Hey, well, good evening and welcome everyone to Working Rangelands Wednesdays, where we explore topics around rangeland agriculture in California and across the West. This is the fifth webinar of our second series, Managing Drought in 2022. The first series we hosted was in summer of 2020 and also focused in large part on drought management. So if you're interested in checking out those recordings, all of them are available on our Working Rangelands Wednesdays YouTube channel. We'll drop the link in the chat. And the other webinars that we posted this series are also available and up on that YouTube channel as well. My name is Grace Woodmansey, and I'm the Livestock and Natural Resources Advisor for Siskiyou County Cooperative Extension.
I'm Dan Macon. I'm the Livestock and Natural Resources Advisor in Placer, Nevada, Sutter, and Yuba counties.
And I'm Leslie Roach, Associate Professor of Cooperative Extension and Rangeland Management at UC Davis.
So just a couple reminders before we get started. We are recording this webinar and it will be posted later on our YouTube channel. For our live webinar participants, we ask that you use the Q&A feature, which is located at the bottom of your screen if you have any questions. We'll be monitoring the Q&A and we'll have time after the presentation to answer those questions. So tonight's discussion is all about strategies for managing irrigated pasture during drought. And we have Livestock and Natural Resources Advisor David Lile here to speak with us. David serves Lassen County as an advisor and is the county director for Lassen, Plumas, and Sierra counties. He earned his bachelor's and master's degrees in range and wildland science, both from UC Davis. And David has led many research and outreach efforts focused on enhancing irrigated pasture production and watershed management. And with that, I'll turn it over to David.
Thank you, Grace. And then I will share my screen. Whoops. Okay. Let me get this arranged too so I can see what I'm showing. Okay, thank you again, Grace and everyone. Nice to be here this evening and talking about irrigated pasture and drought. Just a couple quick points before we get started. This presentation is definitely got some Intermountain bias to it. So as Grace mentioned, Lassen, Plumas, Sierra are my counties. Work, throughout the Intermountain region. And that's most of what my frame of reference and experience is. So if you've got some, input or suggestions about things as they relate to other parts of California, please put those in the chat and we would be happy to fold those into the conversation. Also, I'm just going to sort of warn you, this is a kind of a light presentation, summer evening, not going to be a lot of hardcore data or charts or that sort of thing. So just wanted, folks to be in line with that. And hopefully that's what you would prefer as well. So, okay, let's go ahead and get started. And so to begin, I kind of want to distinguish, between a general lack of irrigation water and drought. And for us, at least in Northeastern California, it's two different things. We have a lot of systems that, are always somewhat short on water. And so, that's a different scenario than you usually have plenty of water, except you happen to be in a drought and you're short one particular year. And with these, dry periods and droughts that we've had over the last 20 years or so, we're starting to see more people sort of rethink where they are in this spectrum and think about, maybe instead of, being short on water in some of these fields as an outlier, maybe it's more of a regular thing and we should sort of adapt to that. And so, thinking kind of about this gradient. So we have instances where maybe it's mostly dry land, but occasionally you've got extra water to supplement the natural precipitation. Maybe you've got a low priority water right, and in particularly wet years, you have extra water. or some scenario where maybe, 1 year out of 3 or 4, you've got extra water to use. And then maybe the next, step down a little bit wetter is, and this is probably our most common scenario in our area, and that is that you're reliant on surface water that is typically gone by midsummer. So you're not downstream of some large irrigation reservoir or something that's, that buffers you over the season, but you basically have, spring runoff water that extends into summer, but often by late summer, you're lacking the necessary amount of water to irrigate. And then at the wetter end of the scale, most years you have enough water for full irrigation, but you can be vulnerable to drought. And so thinking about these partial season irrigation water scenarios, depending on where you may fall in that gradient, it's really important to have the right kind of pasture species, the right mix on the ground. And this again is where I was saying before, some people are sort of second guessing or starting to rethink this and maybe thinking, with all these dry years, we should lean towards some of these drier species. But the driest forage species that we have, or adapted to the driest conditions that we have, that does respond well to irrigation water is intermediate wheatgrass. Typically, we grow it as a dryland species, but when we have extra water, it does respond well to that extra water, and it will be more productive. It does not like a full season of water. So if you've got a full season of water, that's definitely not what you want. But it does respond well to partial season. And then if you don't have any irrigation water whatsoever, it does just fine as a dryland species. And then smooth brome is one that's a little bit in the middle, also can respond well to partial season. Tall fescue would be the next notch down, and this is a really common and popular grass. It does really well under a full season irrigation, but it can also survive periods of summer drought. And so this is one that fits again in a lot of our scenarios that we have. And then the last one that I'll mention, native sod, native pastures that have not been farmed and improved and seeded to improve species, they tend to be less productive than any of the species above, but they are really adaptable in terms of survival. And so they can survive being very, very wet. They can also survive dry years and be just fine. So let's transition from this, different scenarios of what's wet and what's dry. And let's make the assumption that you're in a place that you normally get a full season of irrigation water. When you think irrigated, you think all summer. But in this particular dry year, you've got really dry conditions. In this picture, this is a 2021 picture of our largest irrigation reservoir in Lassen County, and this was taken in May, which is the peak of our runoff and storage season. So that's a good example of really dry year. So what are some of the strategies, scenarios, and things to talk about when we've normally got a pretty good, reliable irrigation, and then in a particular year we do not. So in that scenario, you've really got two main objectives. And the first one is you just want to keep that pasture alive. You just don't want to lose your stand. That's the top priority. Because if you lose that stand, the expense of getting it reestablished and the time that it's out of production and all those things are way more costly than just a dry year where you didn't get much production from it. And so that's always sort of the number one priority, and the risk of that stand loss is going to vary, and it's going to vary depending on the site. It's going to vary depending on the pasture species that you've got growing there. We'll dive into that a little bit more detail here in a second. And then the second objective, assuming that you're going to be able to keep things alive, is how do you optimize forage production with that limited water? So let's talk a little bit about the risk of stand loss in a dry year. So you've kind of got different categories. And again, these kind of go on a gradient, but you've got, potentially a scenario where you've got pretty drought resilient, tough, hard to kill species. Against native sod meadows are about the toughest. Alfalfa is often very tolerant of drought. Tall fescue, the wheat grasses I've mentioned before. And then the site is really important too. And so where you've got finer textured soils, higher organic matter, deeper soil profile, essentially where you've got a lot of rooting capacity, those kinds of sites tend to be really resilient to a particular dry year. And maybe they don't grow much and maybe they don't do much, but they tend to live through the year. The places that we see are most susceptible and where you have, higher risk of losing the whole stand. So orchard grass, little less drought hardy than some of the other species, perennial ryegrass. If anybody wants to disagree with me on perennial ryegrass, do so. Don't have a ton of experience with it here. We see it a little bit, but it's also not super cold hardy. So if you want to disagree on that one, that's fine. But then, thinking about those sites, so where you've got lighter textured soils, maybe you've got some sort of sandy-ish soils, and or if you've got really shallow soils, so you just don't have that rooting capacity to get through those dry months, those are going to be the places where you're susceptible to losing the stand. So then it really comes down to this basic decision around stand loss. Do you try to save it or do you not? And that really depends on your assessment of what's reasonable within the current conditions that you see. If you think it's really, really dry and maybe have almost no water, and you're in one of those really susceptible types of situations with orchard grass on shallow soil, say, maybe it's a write-off, right? Maybe you focus using that water somewhere else. On the flip side, if it's more of a resilient sort of site and you think you can save it, then again, it's probably worthwhile to do so. But that's the decision that you've always got to make. And if you come down to all I want to do is just keep this thing alive, then infrequent irrigation spaced throughout the growing season, just keep enough soil moisture there that it keeps your field going and alive, maybe not very productive. That's a strategy. It's more likely to succeed, again, with more drought resilient species and sites. I think it's an easier to do strategy in our area where we still have cooler nights. We got a shorter growing season, not quite as hot during the day. I think we can limp through easier here than maybe in the foothills where it gets hotter for a longer period of time. This does require that you have at least a little bit of midsummer water, and that might not be the case for some people. Okay, let's switch gears here a little bit and think about a scenario where, okay, we've got enough water that we're not worried about losing the entire stand. And so we're really in this place of, it's going to live through, but how do we optimize our production with this limited amount of water? And this is a really common place for us to be, we're not worried about losing our stand, but we just really want to figure out how we can make the most of what we've got. And so let's start with talking about timing of irrigation and the distribution of irrigation water across the field. Okay, here is a slide. And this is alfalfa, but it is very applicable, I think, to irrigated pasture. And I think it serves the purpose of the point that I want to make. And so this is the percentage of the total annual yield by cutting. And so, you've got these initial cuttings in the springtime or June, early June. depending on 3-cut or 4-cut rotations. But those first cuttings are, 35, 40% of the total production. That second cutting is less, and then it becomes less and less over the year. So in California, at least Northern California, we have cool season species that want to grow fast in the springtime. That's when they want to do their thing, and that's when they naturally are most productive. I think we want to keep that point in mind. This next slide also sort of illustrates that. Again, talking about alfalfa cutting schedules, but again, very applicable to irrigated pasture species. And that is that the bulk of our growth, the bulk of our production is springtime and through early summer. And then you get this natural slowdown. One place where irrigated pasture might look a little different is we tend to have maybe a little more severe summer slump with some of the species, tall fescues in particular. When it gets hot midsummer, tend to slow down. So that might look a little bit flatter in the middle of summer there. But, by and large, most of our production happens early. So let's take advantage of that in our drought strategy, right? The spring is when it wants to grow. We usually have some soil moisture in the spring. And so it gives you something to build upon in terms, if you do have some irrigation water, you're not trying to fill that soil profile from scratch. That makes it a lot easier to get something out of a small amount of water. It also makes it easier if you're, flood irrigating to get, a charge of water across the entire check. So benefit there. Also, as I talked about earlier, that's when we tend to have surface water available anyway. And so let's take advantage of that fact. So I would say timing wise, most often, the best scenario is to build on that spring water availability and just keep it going. Put the water that you have into that first cutting, that first, charge of growth. And then if you've got more, just keep it going for as long as you can. That would be my suggestion in terms of timing. So now let's talk about distributing it across the field, because you got two distinct options. So you could put, on one hand, a normal supply of water on a limited area. And I'm assuming, we don't have our normal amount of water to irrigate with. We're restricted. But you could put a normal amount of water on a limited area, or a limited supply of water on the entire field, right? So which do you think? I would say for optimizing production, you're better off to put a normal supply of water on a limited area. Plants grow with water. Old Harry Carlson quote that I'll never forget: plants grow in the presence of water, not in search of it. And so if you're limited in water, provide it to the plants that you can, get their growth from them that you can, and don't just try to spread a little bit across and nothing is okay. Now, as we mentioned before, if you're in the zone of just trying to keep things alive and you really don't care whether it grows or not, then the flip side is probably what you want, and that is to put a limited supply of water on the entire field. So it does depend on what your objective is for that given growing season. All right, let's talk about managing grazing a little bit. I think the key thing on grazing is just moderate intensity. I would say 4 inches, that's just a little bit of a random thing. It could really be more than that in a really dry year. And what you're trying to do there with maintaining that residual grass and not grazing it too tight is, provide some protection to those crowns, maybe shade the soil a little bit, buffer that soil surface temperature, preserve that soil moisture a little bit by keeping it shaded. So I would be, really inclined to not graze very intensely during a drought. And I know that can be difficult to do. You're probably short on forage anyway. There's a temptation to try to use, every bit that's there, but I would try to refrain from that and maintain a higher amount of cover than normal. And I think during the growing season, 3 or 4 inches is a good place anyway. I think it keeps us, a good level of leaf area to capture light and, promote photosynthesis and, rebound quickly after grazing. But I think it's even more critical in a drought scenario. Now we get into dormancy, we get into winter dormancy, then I think you can take it down a little bit, closer. I would say you could graze it more normally, once you get into late fall, winter. And for me, that recommendation is more like leave 2 or 3 inches. Again, we don't want to, take it down to too low in order to promote that tiller development and available sugars and carbohydrates for the following year's growth. So bottom line, avoid that dry year intense use combination. I think, I don't have it on the slide, but, another grazing, thing to consider is in a dry year, short on forage, short on high quality forage, you may want to give some thought in terms of how you allocate that irrigated pasture forage. It probably is going to be somewhat higher quality. And so making sure that you're running that through, some class of animal where you're getting maximum bang for your buck, whether that's something that's growing or, heifers that you're going to, be wanting to breed up or even pairs, but trying to get, maximum bang for your buck. Okay, fertility, should you consider a nitrogen application? I think, a lot of times it's a dry year, it's drought. Oh, why put on nitrogen? Well, I would say strongly consider it. And even this past year, kind of went through this scenario with a couple of different ranches here. And in both cases, I thought it was pretty clear, good idea to use nitrogen. And the reason for that is if you've got a good improved pasture and you've got at least enough water for, the early part of the season, that March through June part of the season, then, you can use up and make good use of 75, 80 pounds of nitrogen, and you can get a good response from that application. And so again, knowing that things are going to be short, knowing that water is going to be short, feed's going to be in short supply, hay expensive or hard to find, make the very most of that water that you do have in the springtime. And so that can be done with, a strategic application of nitrogen, again, on a good site. If it's just native, sod meadow or something like that, it just tend to not respond well enough to warrant nitrogen. Now, I will say don't overdo it. So only put on the amount of nitrogen that you've got irrigation water that, the plants can use. Fertilizer without irrigation is wasted. And even worse than that, if you put on, nitrogen on water stressed plants, you can create a nitrate issue, which is the last thing anybody needs to deal with on a drought year. So managing pests and weeds, I mean, everything's tight, right, in a dry year, and weeds are an obvious competitor for limited water. So, I would suggest, be aggressive on those. For us in the Northeast, grasshopper outbreaks have been more common, and they're correlated to these dry years. And so they really compound the lack of forage production. So if you are in a place where grasshoppers are an issue, I would really urge you scout early, treat early. It's by far the most economic time to treat is in those early instars. Generally, if you got 15 or more grasshoppers per square yard, you're right in that economic threshold where it's worthwhile to treat. What we see is it's sort of these semi-wet fields that are most susceptible to grasshopper infestation. So if you got a really wet meadow or a field that you can get full water to, we don't see those getting hit as hard as those sort of marginally somewhat green, but kind of also dry, fields. And if you've got fields like that and you think you've got grasshoppers in the area, and you haven't treated and you've got a high infestation of grasshoppers by mid-late summer, get in there and graze those fields ahead of the swarm, because that's where they're going to head. And we've seen them just wipe out fields. And it's really disheartening when you're saving back some forage on some of these drier fields that you think, oh, I can use that in the fall, and then the hoppers wipe it out midsummer. Always, just the risk, just the heads up about poisonous plants in a dry year, anytime you've got less forage. And I really think the biggest thing with poisonous plants isn't, sometimes it's a lack of forage, but oftentimes it's, that dry forage that's not as palatable and green as it normally is. So some of those, sometimes on these edges, these ditch banks, we've got some poisonous plants that typically animals will ignore. You get in a dry year and things aren't as palatable as normal. That's when we've seen, kind of out of the blue, animals eating some of these poisonous plants and having problems. So just a heads up. Establishing new fields during drought cycles. If you're kind of in between fields, you've rotated out a field and you're planning on reseeding it, but then boy, all of a sudden we're in a really dry year, and maybe, predicted for another dry year or something like that. I would say be careful and maybe rethink doing that. Certainly, you could get some stuff started in the spring most likely, but, new seedlings are not likely to be able to handle summer drought stress if you run out of water. And so you're, likely to fail in that kind of scenario. The other thing is, you're putting what limited water you have into little seedlings that aren't going to produce all that much in the short term. So maybe you be better off doing some sort of short season thing, spring oats or spring wheat, or maybe a triticale planting or something like that, that you get a little more bang for your buck in terms of forage production, with less water, rather than going, trying to get a new field started. So cautionary statement there. So I want to talk a little bit about this, idea, long-term pasture management and health and soil health and all those kinds of things as a drought management strategy. And the first thing I want to say, and I bring this up because we get into these droughts and you see stuff in the common literature and you see, it's these almost too good to be, well, they are too good to be true stories of, I did this new management and boy, hardly any water and I've got these lush pastures. Well, I'm sorry, but you're not going to completely offset drought effects and the fundamental need the plant have for growth and survival. They need water. And so it's not going to cure those impacts of drought, but it can, I think, help buffer those impacts and reduce to some extent some of that short-term loss. And so, really fundamental things like maintaining plant vigor. And so really, to me, that's maintaining the best you can for your site and with resources you got available, but maintaining soil moisture appropriately, maintaining fertility. And that doesn't mean you've got to be pouring fertilizer to it all the time. I mean, you can do it with almost no input, but just if you've got some, you've got some deficiencies, address those if you can, and then make sure you've got that nutrient cycling with your grazing and manure functioning as well as you can. And then, balancing that intensity of grazing use and providing some opportunity for rest and some opportunity for those plants to grow and maintain vigor and grow some roots and that sort of thing. So we're not always keeping that pasture, grazed down to 2 inches. Let it grow up a little bit now and then bring it down. And by grow up, I mean, even a foot or so. You don't have to let it, get 3 feet tall. That becomes harder to use efficiently. But give it a chance to grow. Give it a little bit of rest now and then. I think that, and then I think the other thing that sneaks up on us sometimes is probably a bigger deal than maybe we think about, but soil compaction. Trying to avoid grazing wet soils, that's when compaction is most likely to happen, and trying to reduce, this prolonged high intensity use. Hoof compaction, there is a lot of pressure on, livestock hoofs and that repeated over time, over years, you can create some soil compaction. And I think this isn't a great analogy, but one that I've been, really distinct this summer is we saw some black oaks dying, and in the area where they were all fine except for these little patch that was right adjacent to this horse corral, where horses kind of stood over there to be in the shade. And I'm just almost certain that the compaction there was the difference maker. And so we want to make sure that we're not inhibiting infiltration and availability of water on these sites through our management, if we can help it. So getting to the end here, using irrigation management tools. This is not, I'm not an irrigation management specialist at all. I'm not going to get deep into this, but there are some tools out there. Watermark sensors are a really good one that, not hard to use, and we can, help you with this in the future if somebody's interested, but helps you keep track of that soil moisture status, different places in the field, different depths. It's pretty easy. It's pretty fast, doesn't cost a ton. Pretty readily available, the CIMMYS weather stations that tell you the evapotranspiration or, how much, soil moisture, crops should be using in your area. And just, things to help you maintain that soil moisture efficiently as you can. And when you think about managing that, don't wait until you're short. Don't wait till midsummer. Start that water management early in the season when you still have water to manage. So, want to put that out there. That bottom picture doesn't look like very good irrigation water management to me. I will refrain from saying what county that picture was taken in. Wasn't mine. All right. Just kind of a quick summary. You get into a drought scenario. First thing, assess your conditions and priorities. Are you trying to save your field? Or are you, okay that your field is going to be, going to live through it, and you're just trying to optimize production? Really know where you are within that context. Take advantage and optimize the early season growth. Put what you can into that time period. Graze moderately. Resist the temptation to get every last blade of grass, even though I know it feels like you need it and you can use it. Manage weeds and pests to reduce the competition. And then, if applicable, think about some of those short season forage alternatives that might be a bigger bang for your buck in terms of water. And with that, I know that's my last slide. If there's any questions or discussion.
Thank you, David. I think that was a really, really good overview of lots of different strategies that folks may want to consider during a drought. I will remind our participants that we'd be happy to take your questions. If you can add them to the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen, that would be great. We do have one for you already, David. We had someone from the foothills who's wondering if there are any specific tips or strategies that you may recommend for irrigating efficiently on sloped ground.
Yeah, that's a big challenge. Trying to manage the rate at which you put water on so you get infiltration as much as possible is the way. Doing that is a lot harder than saying that. I'm gonna defer maybe to Dan, because I think maybe Dan's got more experience in that.
I think that's a really critical and challenging question in the foothills. I think part of it's due to the variability in soil depth and soil type that we see on slopes. And so it's pretty easy to oversaturate the toe of a slope and be dry by the time that happens on the upper part of the slope. So I think part of it goes back to some of the principles that David talked about in terms of, maybe thinking about the right species for the location on the slope. Some of those more drought tolerant things where you've got shallower soils may be appropriate, and recognizing you're going to have differences in productivity. I think the other piece that we really recommend here in Placer, Nevada, is to talk within RCS about ways to change the irrigation system in those types of environments. Things like movable pod sprinklers can be a way to kind of normalize water distribution across a slope like that too. Good question. David, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to add on to that. We've seen an increase in use of actual, alfalfa risers and buried pipe and that sort of thing, which much more efficient application, technology than kind of the old open ditch with the tarp laid across. So, we have seen that, evolve and increase over time. And so I do think, some of those things can help as well.
Kind of to expand on something that we've seen in the foothills, and I'm curious if you've seen this up there at all, where we've had really, really dry springs and we start irrigation season without much soil moisture. And that kind of combined with the prospect for maybe a short season, or are you still better off trying to catch up in that early season when you finally do get water? Or would you try to extend that over the course of the whole season and maybe be short, deficit irrigating across the whole season?
I think, unless you're really worried again about losing the whole field, I would tend towards, emphasizing that springtime period. You don't have a full soil profile, but you've got usually a partial, at least we do, because it's so cold in the winter. Our ET is evapotranspiration is almost nothing. And so once things start growing, then you usually at least have some soil moisture. And I think it's easier to manage from that point than to let it just continue being partially dry all year.
David, I'm really glad that you talked a little bit about the balance between maybe thinking about reestablishing pastures with different grasses or different varieties to build more resilience for future drought. That's a question that comes up a lot in Siskiyou, and I'm wondering if people are kind of considering reestablishing their pasture once we are out of this current drought. How could you kind of layer in some strategies to combat compaction? I know soil compaction was something that you mentioned in your talk. Are there any specific strategies that people can kind of be thinking about if they are looking to reestablish pasture?
I think it depends on where that compaction is and how severe it is. If it's right at the surface and not terribly severe, I think those can heal themselves with rest and forage growth and that sort of thing over time, largely. If it's a deeper compaction or some kind of restrictive layer or something like that, then you're talking about the need for some kind of tillage operation and that varies by site as to whether or not that's going to be worthwhile. But it's more expensive, but it can be a big help. So I would sort of say it's going to depend on the depth and severity of that compaction. And if it's not so bad, I do think they can largely heal themselves with some rest and some management over time. We get a lot of freeze thaw in the winter that I think helps loosen things up a little bit in that respect as well. But I know there's been some, people talk about that helps, but it's also that growing season when you've got that soil microfauna working and that sort of thing, that biological activity helps with that compaction as well. So I think to some extent you can fix those through management if they haven't gone too far.
Thank you. Oh, Leslie, go ahead.
I just was curious, David's thoughts. We've got so we have some folks down here in the valley that have expressed interest in applying some ag tech to increase watering irrigation efficiency in their pastures. And so we've been kind of experimenting a bit with some low cost, but reliable water sensors, and then figuring out how to connect those so that folks can receive, like a message, something like as simple as a text message, to kind of help them gauge, where the water is or what the soil moisture conditions are in their pasture as it moves through the season. This course in the valley, I think that, Dan and I have talked previously, it probably wouldn't really work very well in the foothills on those more challenging terrains. But is that something that, in your area, folks are also, saying as a challenge, is just thinking about just the efficiency of the watering, and if they can control a little more closely or precisely the timing of water, water shut on and shut off. Do you think that would be useful at all?
I think in these dry years, there definitely would be, because that is a real challenge of getting that as accurate and as precise as possible to make sure you've covered the field, but you haven't wasted. And so, I think when it's difficult, and I probably hate to say this, but I think it's true. I think when we have wet cycles and water's pretty available, some of these irrigated pasture systems, sometimes they're not the top priority in terms of management. But I think in these dry years, yeah, I think they would be interested in that.
Dan, any other questions on your end?
Tons, but I'd keep David here all night.
Yeah.
Now, one of the things that you brought up that I'm interested in thinking a little more in depth about here is the idea of some of these summer dormant species and how we use pastures like that versus how we use something that's growing all through the summer.
Right.
Are there some differences of how we'd want to graze some of those summer dormant things in July and August as compared to how we might graze a more traditionally planted pasture?
That's a good question. I would say that there probably is. And, again, it sort of depends on that gradient, but it almost becomes a little bit more like a rangeland situation where you have this flush of growth and that's it. And if you want to bank it and graze it later, you can, but you're not managing regrowth and that sort of thing. And if you bank it and graze it later, you're probably losing some quality, but maybe you don't care. Maybe having that fall feed or late summer feed is worth losing a little bit of that quality. And it often is. But yeah, I think that's a good question, Dan, and one, to dive into more. But in general, I would equate it to almost more like a rangeland situation.
That's a really good way to think about it. I hadn't put that together, but it's almost like enhanced rangeland.
It is,
as opposed to irrigated pasture.
Yeah. And the places where we have intermediate wheatgrass and that it's very much, it's a fine line between that and enhanced rangeland or dryland pasture.
Yeah. To some degree, I think maybe the equivalent here in the foothills is thinking about some of these annual rangeland sites that if we have water in September, we can get germinated before the rains come and have some increased productivity on them too.
Right. I agree. I don't think that would work as well for us. I wish it would, but I do think that's something worthwhile because it gets you out of that heat of the summer. And so I think it's easier to make good use of that water, when it's not 110.
Yeah.
Well, unfortunately, it looks like we're about at time, but that was a great discussion. And thank you so much, David, for sharing your expertise with us this evening. So with that concludes our 5th session of the 2022 Working Rangelands Wednesdays Drought Series. Thank you to everyone who attended, and thank you again to David. Our next webinar will be 2 weeks from today on September 7th at 6 p.m. And we'll focus on drought forecasting and remote sensing with Dr. Leslie Roach, who's the Associate Professor of Cooperative Extension in Range Management. And if you have specific questions you would like to submit about that topic, please feel free to email us in advance of the September 7th webinar. And with that, We'll look forward to seeing you all for our final webinar of this series on September 7th, and have a great night. Thanks, everyone.